If you're joining us for the first time, I need to tell you that my remarks may go on a little bit longer than usual today. This is an important, I have a lot of things to say, as you might imagine. Once upon a time, there was a congregation who called a minister to come and dwell among them, to share their joys and sorrows, and to walk with them into the future. One fine fall day, some members of the congregation invited the minister to go fishing with them. As lunchtime approached, the person who had brought the sandwiches remarked, "Botheration, I think I left the mustard sitting on the roof of the car." And sure enough, a quick scan of the binoculars confirmed that, indeed, yes, the mustard was there across the waters. So close, and yet so far. "Not a problem," said the minister. She stepped out of the boat. She walked across the waters, and in no time at all, she returned with the condiment of choice. "Just our luck," said one of her hosts. "We got the one that can't swim." My thanks to my colleague in ministry, Fran Dearman, for sharing that story with me. Today I'm going to talk about the relationship between minister and congregation. As this year goes on, you'll be considering that and also maybe thinking about what your next direction is going to be with a vocational minister. At first, this might not seem spiritual relevant to your life. You might be asking yourself, what does the relationship between minister and congregation have to do with my deepest spiritual needs? More than anything else, perhaps, is the answer. You'll be searching for a minister, and though you might want the minister to walk on water, he or she will be very human. And we'll be here talking about God and doubt, different theological ideas, Unitarian Universalism, ethical and justice issues, life and death. She or he or they will lead you in prayer, meditation, and contemplation. The person you hire as your minister will have a profound influence on the spiritual and ethical nature of this congregation's membership and your personal spiritual journey in this faith. Geoffrey Chaucer's description of the parson from the Canterbury Tales tells us even that more than 600 years ago, there were ideals about what constituted the perfect clergy person. We also have such ideals, and those ideals might not be shared traits, skills, and values. We might be having different expectations about what makes a good minister for this church. There's none who might be perfect in everyone's estimation. To be honest, if a Unitarian Universalist minister stays with the congregation for 12 years or more, then the church and the minister have changed to fit each other. Initially, though, there are always differing expectations. This is also important because relatively few, only about 10% of Unitarian Universalists, actually were reared in this faith. The other 90% of us grew up in other faiths or none. Along the way, we might have learned some things about clergy that are not true for Unitarian Universalist ministers. If you grow up Baptist, Congregationalist, or even in the Reformed Jewish tradition, then your understanding of Unitarian Universalist ministry is probably closest to those traditions, because those religious movements also have congregational polity. Like most religious traditions, Unitarian Universalist ministers are held to a high standard of ethical behavior. As Chaucer wrote, "If gold should rust, what should iron do?" He meant that clergy are to be held to a higher ethical standard than most people and try to lead by example. Unitarian Universalist ministers are also to be holding to the Unitarian Universalist Ministers Association Ethical Code of Conduct. Those ethical guidelines describe the role that ministers should take and not take with their congregations. They include not breaking the law except in case of civil disobedience. They include not dating congregants at all. Unitarian Universalist ministers are as different as Unitarian Universalists are. We come in all shapes, sizes, and colors. We are gay, straight, and in between. Some of us are transgendered. The majority of Unitarian Universalist ministers are women. I've actually served one Unitarian Universalist congregation that had previously only women ministers. On the first Sunday, a member told me that I had broken the glass ceiling. And there were members who were opposed to having a male minister. During one children's message, I told the congregation that boys could also grow up to be Unitarian Universalist ministers. It's a different world, thank goodness. Unitarian Universalist clergy also derive their spiritual center from amazingly diverse sources. The most frequently listed are humanist, Christian, theist, neo-pagan, Buddhist, and eclectic combinations of theological traditions. It is rare in my experience to find Unitarian Universalist ministers who can serve in only one theological tradition. Most of our clergy, regardless of their theological orientation, can serve the typical Unitarian Universalist Heinz 57 varieties, congregations like this one. Humanist ministers celebrate Christmas. Neo-pagan ministers commemorate the Jewish holidays. Christian ministers will preach about Darwin, atheism, and Taoism. Almost all Unitarian Universalist ministers care about social justice, living our ideals in the larger world. In my experience, I have only encountered a handful of the hundreds of ministers in our tradition I have known who were not interested in social justice at all. We are also concerned about gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgendered issues. I've only encountered 2 Unitarian Universalist ministers who were clearly homophobic. One was an elderly humanist minister, and I attributed his homophobia to age and inflexibility. The other one was surprisingly a younger neo-pagan minister. Neither was typical. If you're gay, lesbian, or transgendered, or have other identities, it is safe to presume that your Unitarian Universalist minister cares about your civil rights and spiritual well-being. Our clergy have fallen far from the tree. The Unitarian movement traces its origins back to the Puritans, the original English settlers in New England, the original born-agains on this continent. The Puritans came to New England from different places in Old England. They were people determined to establish Calvinist religious communities as far from the Church of England as possible. The original Puritan church was composed of people who were born again. They called themselves the regenerate. They also called themselves saints. In their congregations, everyone was considered equal because everyone was one of the elect, the chosen of God. They called a man to minister to them not in the belief that he was better than they were, but in the hope that he would be better educated in religion than they were. The authority given to Puritan ministers was based upon their learning, a learned ministry. He was not gifted with extraordinary powers. His role was much like that of a rabbi in the Jewish tradition. He was first and foremost a teacher. That does not mean that the Puritan ministers in Massachusetts were not powerful. They could have someone put in irons for blasphemy, immortality, drunkenness, and lack of deference. They could bring charges against unruly congregants. They had real political power. In other words, those were the good old days. But for all their power, the Puritan ministers were accountable to their congregations. Their power was derived from the calling of the congregation. They were not appointed by a large body. No bishop would oversee their authority. Some Puritan descendant churches later became liberals, believing that each individual had the ability to determine religious truth from his or her experience, advocating a creedless Christian faith. Those people became Unitarians. Unitarians inherited the congregational structure and expectations of the role of clergy from their Puritan forebears. By this time, the clergy had lost a lot of the power. They could no longer put people in chains, for example, or the stockade or something like that. Their churches were operated by the laity, with the minister tending to preaching, teaching, sacraments, and pastoral duties. The ministers mostly, though, preached and visited congregants. That sounds like an easy life for the clergyman, but it was not. Preaching in those days took 5 or 6 hours every Sunday. Imagine sitting there in a wooden pew for that long. Imagine speaking for 5 or 6 hours with a new sermon every 2 weeks. The clergy back then might write 1 or 2 sermons a month, but they would share pulpits. So once you finished your 6-hour-long sermon, then you went to another church, and the other minister came to your church. Preaching then must have been as daunting a task as listening to a sermon. The Unitarians kept the polity of the Puritans, but they made one very significant change. They gave their ministers freedom of the pulpit, recognizing that with the new experiment in personal theology, that most individuals in any given congregation would believe differently. They also recognized that it would be impossible for any minister to speak to all of the theologies present, and even the most homogeneous congregation. Freedom of the pulpit meant, and still means, that the minister speaks the truth to the best of given ability. It means that ministers cannot satisfy all the theological positions in any Unitarian Universalist congregation, and they are not expected to try. It means that most Unitarian Universalists will find themselves differing with their ministers eventually. Such differences of opinion are built into our system, and they have always been there. The minister has freedom of the pulpit. The laity have freedom of the pew. And it's all right to disagree with your minister. In the fullness of time, Unitarians envisioned ministry differently. They began to admit women into their ministry. As I said before, the majority of Unitarian Universalist ministers are women nowadays. Later, Unitarian Universalists admitted openly gay and lesbian and transgendered persons to the ministry as well. When I went to seminary, I was told that despite the fact that laity actually run the church in our tradition, the minister spends most of his, her, or their time administering it. Administration means attending meetings, starting and running programs, overseeing staff, checking up on all the work of the various committees, and supporting and sometimes inspiring them. When thinking about the role of the minister, I came up with 5 different types of relationships between the minister and the congregation. And these are ones that I have seen in different Unitarian Universalist congregations. Boss, charismatic, consulting, collaborative, and excluded. The boss relationship makes the minister the CEO of the congregation by the congregation's choice. The charismatic is similar, but the authority of the minister to run the congregation is based upon his or her charisma and appeal, and might not be a written down role, but one that has evolved over time. The consulting minister is outside the congregation's normal functioning, but is brought in occasionally to add to the conversation. The collaborative minister shares power equally with lay leadership and is always at the table when significant matters are discussed. The excluded minister is not really invited to be part of the congregation, does a few defined tasks, and has no authority whatsoever in the congregation's life, not even influence. You might think, how long could an excluded minister last? I served as interim minister to a congregation that had an excluded minister for 15 years. That minister had followed another minister who was mentally ill and an interim minister who had poor boundaries. And those were the first two ministers that the congregation had encountered. The congregation decided they needed a full-time minister, but were wary of interacting often with a clergy person. So they called a minister who would hardly be present. The minister preached on Sundays, attended board meetings, and sometimes attended worship committee meetings, loosely supervised staff, and occasionally performed pastoral duties. The minister was not very present in the life of the congregation otherwise. During the interim ministry, the congregation changed its attitude about working with ministers, though, and decided to pursue a more collaborative relationship with clergy. In my personal experience, most Unitarian Universalist ministers want a collaborative relationship with the congregation. Most want to share power in the decision-making and running and envisioning the future together. Most want to talk to lay leadership about the congregation's operations and discern between the minister and lay leadership who should do what. An important aspect that congregations in our movement that began as fellowships like this one often overlook is the need for the minister to feel important. The minister needs to feel that she or he is making a difference, giving life to his or her calling, working with people who appreciate the sacrifices that attend normal practice of the Unitarian Universalist ministry. This is not just some degree of ego validation, but the very human need to feel that one is involved with those who are around oneself. Ours is a tradition that has always emphasized democracy. Ministers do not have the authority to impose their will upon the congregation unless the congregation permits them to. Unitarian Universalist ministers, though, do not even have a single vote in the matters that are of greatest importance to the congregation. Any committee meeting that I am attending, they cast a vote and my hand will be down. I don't have the power, nor do I have at the board meetings, have a vote. In our tradition, ministers do not have the power to threaten congregations with hellfire or God's will. In other words, we have no stick and a very small carrot. An older minister once told me that the only thing that Unitarian Universalist ministers have in common are issues with authority, and you know who you are. That is probably true. Sometimes congregants distrust the authority of the minister, even if such authority is rarely exercised. We have all witnessed the misuse of authority by religious persons that makes the news on regular occasions. Some might distrust the minister because of past experiences with clergy. Unitarian Universalist ministers know this. They also have issues with authority, but they least persons with authority issues because they know how this feels. Our ministers lead by facilitating the congregation's mission and vision. The congregation envisions its future, and the minister helps the congregation to reach it. In our democratic faith, the congregation shares its vision to ministry, its shared ministry. These are some of the things that this congregation needs to think about with its next ministry. I've shared with you some of the denominational norms of ministry, so you would at least know about them. Let me share with you that every relationship, every covenant, takes a continuing conversation to adjust expectations. This is not something that is taught in seminary to those about to enter ministry, nor does every minister know that this needs to happen. In every relationship, someone needs to turn to the other and say, let's talk about the relationship. Every 3 to 5 years in ministry, the congregation and the minister need to talk about the relationship. When your spouse or partner says, let's talk about the relationship, you probably feel some anxiety and you may feel vulnerable. That is the nature of such a conversation. It is necessary, though, for the minister and the congregation to share their vulnerabilities and to talk about the changes they would like to experience in their life together. It is sometimes stressful, but it does help the minister and the congregation know each other better. Now, some general information about ministers. According to variable sources, the average clergy person works 56 hours a week. At least that figure is from research done 12 years ago. I suspect it's gone up to 60 hours a week. It's the average, and it means that half of clergy work more than 56 to 60 hours a week. Most ministers try to do too much. One of the daunting realities of Unitarian Universalist ministry, it takes 20 hours a week to research, meditate, plan, and write a Sunday service. And in this congregation and others, with Zoom and other issues, I imagine the time is closer to 25 to 30 hours a week. Most of the minister's time is taken with administrative functions, otherwise. When the minister is attending board, committee meetings, or working with staff, writing reports, she is administering the congregation's ministry. Here's something else that most people don't realize. Most ministers are really only good at two aspects of ministry. Your minister may be a good preacher and administrator, but only passable at pastoral care, teaching, rites of passage, and social witness. Some have no skill at working with children and youth. As a congregation, you will need to decide which two things you want your minister to be good at, and let some of it go. There is also the need to give the ministry away. By giving the ministry away, I mean the congregation has to minister to itself and not place all the burden of ministry upon the minister alone. Giving the ministry away is a way of acknowledging that our faith recognizes the priesthood and the prophethood of all believers, as James Luther Adams put it. Simply put, members of UU congregations acknowledge that they all share a ministry. Our faith calls us to action. It is not enough to sign the membership book. Ours is not a faith of belief alone. It is a faith of work. An old Jewish saying says, "It is not your responsibility to finish the work of perfecting the world, but you are not free to desist from it either." Serving as a vocational minister is not a job. When a minister or congregation believe that the minister is just an employee, or bring their experience of employment in a corporation or other entity to the role of ministry, then the relationship is damaged by being unaware of the uniqueness of the relationship. It's most like the covenant of marriage. The analogy is imperfect, but it does serve to remind that ministry is a give and take relationship for which both parties are willing to make sacrifices for the shared good. This is a flawed analogy, but it's about as close as it comes. Walking with a community so determined is the joy and the challenge of being a Unitarian Universalist minister. Walking with people who submerge into this task is one of the privileges of ministry. For as Marge Percy writes, the pitcher cries for water to carry, and a person for work that is real. For such real work, the work of lay ministry and the work of learned ministry, may we be truly grateful. So be it. Blessed be. Amen.